Hi everyone. So this is the introduction to fiction video. We've been working on poetry. You guys, many of you are still working on your poetry projects, but we're scheduled to start talking about fiction. So we're going to start talking about that. Don't worry, if you're a little behind, you'll catch up. But we want to talk then about the differences between poetry and fiction, kind of define what fiction is by talking about the differences between these two. In this course, we're supposed to talk about poetry, fiction, and drama, all three of those. And so we'll kind of talk about what those things are. We're going to look here at this grid that I'll start to fill in the difference between fiction and poetry. What is it we see as the differences between the two? So one difference we can see is that poetry is written in what we call verse, right? Whereas fiction is written in prose. One of the things you can notice in poems, the lines don't go all the way across the page. We didn't have time to talk about that, but one of the things that happens a lot of times is that poets will have a certain number of syllables per line. There are certain things that they're doing there. You're familiar with poetry that rhymes, and so usually we end when we get to a rhyme, and then we go to the next one. And so we don't lay those the words out in the same way that we lay out sentences, which is what we call prose, right? Prose is when we write like in sentences, and that's what you're used to writing when you're going to be, you're writing your actual essays. You're writing an email or something like that, you're going to be writing in what we call prose. So verse is kind of its own thing. And again, there are all these rules about how it works, all these techniques that we use in verse. Again, we didn't have time to really talk about that. It's kind of a shame that we don't, but we kind of have to rush on and talk about other things. But so there is a difference in terms of how those two are written. That's going to be one difference. Another difference between the two is that in fiction, we have stories and those events happen over time. And you're aware of this because you know how to tell a story about something that happened to you. You say, I got up this morning, I left the house, I went to go catch the bus, I rode the bus, somebody got on, started having a fight with the driver or whatever. I mean, but if we're going to do that, we're going to tell the story about what happened. Here's the first thing that happened. I got up. Then I went out and caught the bus. Then somebody got on the bus and started arguing with the driver. And so these events happen in time in that way, right? We're very clear about where we are in time. Sometimes we go back and forth in time, but even when we go back and forth in time, we kind of tell people that that's what we're doing, right? I can remember back to what was happening a couple nights before, right? We can remember back to that. And we can still understand where we're supposed to be in time. And again, you're used to doing this because you know how to tell a story. If you're going to tell people a story about what happened during your day, you are going to be using these kind of time clues, and you're going to tell stories, tell your story in the same way that fiction usually does. In poetry, events don't have to happen in time, and those images can seem randomly placed. Sometimes they do, right, happen in time. That is, if we look at something like Dodhead, at least part of Dodhead is told like a story, right? This is what happened. I say, hand me that ketchup packet over there, and I put the dot on my forehead, and this is what happened. And so there's an element of story sometimes in there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. If you think about what happens in What It's Like to Be a Black Girl, it's like there's an image. First of all, it's doing this, and then there's this, and then there's this. And there isn't a sense that those things occur one after the other. We don't know their relationship in time necessarily. And so poems are much more likely to have this sense of there's just a series of images that we're supposed to kind of fit together. That's one of the things that sometimes makes it hard for us to understand what's going on in a poem. That's why you got a little bit confused in Persimmons when he's talking about what happened with Miss Walker, and then he's with Donna, and you're like, wait, we just jumped around, and now we're talking about his father. We're bouncing around there, and we aren't necessarily stuck in time. And since we're so used to telling stories, if somebody says, look, what happened to me today at work, they're telling you a story based on time. If they just start to give you these images about things that happen and they bounce around, and suddenly they're telling you about something that happened 5 years earlier, you're confused, right? And that's what's going on in something like Persimmons. That's one of the reasons why you got confused. We're not bound by time in that same way, whereas fiction is. So a lot of the fiction is going to be easier for us to understand because there is a clear sense. One thing happened that led to the next thing, that led to the next thing, that led to the next thing. Okay, so that's another difference that we have when we're talking about fiction. A third difference that we have is that fiction is not necessarily true, right? It is something that is not, by its name, it says it's something that we have made up. Okay, and so just keep that in mind that the author is not necessarily talking about themselves, and we will not talk about, this is what the author said about what happened to them. It might be somebody completely different, right? And so by their nature, again, the name fiction means not true. Fiction is seen as not true. That doesn't mean that some of the things that happen in there can't be true, but we just kind of make this assumption that everything in there is not true. It's all made up. Whereas poetry can be true or false. This last point about being true or not true becomes rather important, because recognize that if somebody is going to write a story and it is going to be not true, they can make it unfold in any way that they want to make it unfold. When you watch a movie or you watch a television show, that's fiction, right? That's done in this style of fiction, and those stories in a movie or a television show are constructed in such a way that we get the outcome that we want, right? We can add in events that we want and say, here's this event that kind of that leads to the next event, that leads to the next event, so that's going to let you understand the big idea that I want to get across here. And so authors can decide to include or exclude information, right? They can put anything in that they want. They can say, hey, you know what would be cool to happen in this story is if this thing happened next, right? And when they do that, they're kind of building up the big idea, right? We want to see what's going to happen to the character. So if we want to have a character who's going through a lot of problems, and we want to show how they can potentially overcome those problems, we can keep building up problems. I'm just give them this problem, and then I'm going to give them another problem, and then I'm going to give them another problem. We can just make those up, right? And the idea that they get so many problems but are then able to overcome them is going to suggest to us, oh, okay, now we understand the big idea is that no matter what life throws your way, we might be able to overcome them. And so all of the elements of fiction are going to be added in there to help us understand that big idea. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind, right? Because if you recognize that everything in there is only there because the author wants it to be there, because the author is using those events or those descriptions to help us understand the larger idea, then that becomes easier for us to understand what the story itself means. So when you're going to write about it. So you had in your reading for today the little story about the elephant in the village of the blind, and one of the things you want to think about that story is that people can pick up little bits and pieces of the information from the elephant by touching the elephant and understand some things about it. And they get their own perception from that one little piece that they're going to be looking at. Okay, and the world on some level is like an elephant, right? There's all this stuff out there, and so we can say, look, let me just take this little whatever bits of information that I want, and I'm going to build a story about that that's going to lead us in one direction or the other. So your assignment that you have for the writing assignment that you have for Intro to Fiction. My picture up here. The writing assignment that you have, I saved the questions for Intro to Fiction. So you've got these questions after reading the assignment. You're supposed to talk about the elephant in the village of the blind, and so answer that question. But then in this one, I want you to write two versions of a story, and each version of the story must make us feel a different way. And I say the story can be entirely true, completely made up, or a mixture of the two. And then I say, however, each version of the story should include or exclude details that make the reader feel a certain way. And again, how that's relating back to the elephant in the village of the blind, where if we get certain information, we're going to think some things, but if we get other information, we're going to think other things. So let's see how this happens. I say, so for example, let us say I want you to tell a story about how I fell down in the cafeteria on the first day of high school and spilled my lunch all over the floor. Right? But I want to tell you that story. One version of the story could be tragic and might go like this. And so I give this version of the story, as I say, that says that there's bad things going on here. I use these words to talk about, how embarrassed we might be, right? My first day of high school ruined everything for me, right? This is a bad experience, okay? And I've decided to include certain details and describe it in a certain way that lets you know that it's a bad experience. However, I then have another story, another version of the story about somebody telling the same story, but in a way that's supposed to be funny, right? Did I ever tell you about the time I fell down in the cafeteria on the first day of school, right? Uh, um, and again, if you when you read through this, you'll see that it's meant to be much more lighthearted. This person has not been traumatized by that event. Same event, but I've decided to include different details in one, exclude other details in the other. I've written about it in a slightly different way, right, to give it a different tone. There's certain kinds of language that I use in one that I don't use in the other that tells us how we're supposed to feel about that. And I want you to keep that in mind, that that's something that can be done. So that's why I'm asking you to do it, because when you do it yourself, it's likely that you will start to realize, oh, wait a minute, stories can be changed around. I can decide to make people think one way about something or make them think the other way about something. And then again, when you go to actually write about these stories and think about what they mean, you can look back at the details and be able to see where the author has been including certain kinds of information to kind of get you to think one thing, or they've included information to get you to think something else. And so that's one of the things that we're ultimately going to be writing about when we're writing about the stories. So read through this assignment. And then complete it and upload it to Blackboard. And then that will be the end of part one, and then you can go ahead and move on to part two.